Thanks very much. The Wicklow-Carlow border is contentious when you're from Wicklow and you go to school in Carlow and you play Gaelic football. My speech today is going to be about swimming. And for the last few mornings, Joe and I see a few survivors, we've been swimming off the Irish Sea, not the Irish Sea, off the sea in Donegal. And there's three parts to swimming, which reflect the three parts to my speech here today. There's the bit where you're about to get in, and you don't want to, and it's cold. There's the bit when you do get in, and you cry with the cold. And then there's the bit that you're going against the tide, and that it's still very cold, but you're beginning to warm up, you're beginning to work yourself into it. And then there's the bit where you're coming back, and the sun is on your back, and you feel damn good. And then you get out, and you feel really, really good. So there's three parts to swimming. There's the bad bit, the bit where you have to work at it, and then the bit where it was all worthwhile. So that's how I've structured my speech this morning. And so we'll go with the bad bit. It's called In the Beginning, and the first sentence is, the cost of bailing out Anglo-Irish Bank. It's 4 times more than the entire cost of what the United Nations estimate to spend on reconstructing Haiti, a country devastated by an earthquake in January. It's 20 times the cost what BP estimate will cost to clean up the worst environmental disaster that the United Nations has ever seen since the oil spill off the Gulf. It's the entire budget that Ireland has received from the EU structural funds since Ireland joined the EU in 1973. And sometimes we have to find ways to talk about how big bailing out one bank, never mind all the others, how big it is, because it is big. And I was struck on the morning that Brian Lenihan went into the Dáil to make his speech about bailing out the banks. And I remember that morning because most people were shocked by it. Do you remember? Most people were shocked how big it was. And it was the 30th of March. And on Simon Carswell's front page story in the Irish Times, the word billion, I counted them, was 22 times in his article. And sometimes when the word billion is used so often, we forget how big it is. And when something is so big, we don't think about it anymore. It becomes something else and we ignore it. And sometimes those words become too big to fully appreciate. But we must never forget what happened and why it happened and the context in which it happened. And so I'm not going to give you my reasons, because you can see that in the articles and all of that. So I'm not going to give you my reasons why it happened. I'm going to read you some abstracts from some of the banking inquiry reports. Patrick Holohan. The significant factors contributing to the unsustainable structure of spending in the Irish economy were due to the government's pro-cyclical fiscal policy stance, budgetary measures aimed at boosting the construction sector, and a relaxed approach to the growing reliance on construction-related and other insecure sources of tax revenue. The Regling and Watson Banking Report. These tax reliefs were directed to the property sector, often in particular regions of the country, and they contributed to a more general misallocation of resources, as some of the tax concessions seem to have been granted on an ad hoc basis and in not a fully transparent way. That's page 27. So the context in which, and I get puzzled sometimes because we call this a banking inquiry, but we never ask ourselves the context in which these decisions were made. And the Watson and Regling inquiry help us with that. And they talk about the tax reliefs, the incentive schemes, the income tax exemptions for developers and investors that inflated the price of land and overheated the market. And they included tax reliefs on multi-storey car parks, student accommodation, buildings used for third-level educational purposes, hotels and holiday camps, holiday cottages, rural and urban renewal, park and ride facility, nursing homes, private hospitals, sports injury clinics and childcare facilities. So we have to ask ourselves why we are in the mess that we're in. And sometimes when you start to ask those questions, you're assumed that you're speaking in a particular context. And asking the question, and I'll come to that in a moment, sometimes the very fact that you raise this you're painted in a particular light, which is unfair. So the middle part, so we're now in the sea. And it's swimming out, and it's still very cold. So this is the middle, part one. Young people do care. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. So, first of all, I'm going to read you an email correspondence. And I get hundreds of email correspondence from young people who do care that I've entered into recently. And it's typical of the kind of emails that I get from time to time about young people, from young people on foot of the debate on political reform. Dear Dr Byrne, my name is Cillian Scott. I am 17. I am incredibly interested in politics and eager to learn more and more about the subject. I was watching Prime Time last night, and I was struck with excitement to hear what you had to say. I'll just repeat that last sentence because I like repeating it. I was struck with excitement to hear what you had to say. I see you write about political reform. Today I got my Easter holidays, and I plan to finish an article entitled "Community is Our Greatest Asset in a Recession." Irish history also happens to be my favourite part of history, especially Cumann na Gael, De Valera's government and the emergency. Thank you, Cillian Scott. Second email. Dear Elaine, I'm sorry for not emailing you the community document. However, I am sending you 2 bills I have made. One entitles 16-year-olds to vote. The other entitles the public to remove a councillor, a senator, a TD or MEP. Please excuse the lack of political correctness and the huge amount of errors in the sections. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the Attorney General, hundreds of civil servants and a huge advisory panel. The bill which allows 16-year-olds to vote I would agree with, as I've come across many teenagers willing to help through Corn na Og. Yours sincerely, Cillian Scott. How many people do you know that voluntarily, out of their time, constructs 2 bills? 17 years of age. And the thing about the 2 bills, one bill, he wants to vote at 16, which shows you that young people are interested. But the other, which is very disappointing, it's a bill where he wants to remove politicians. And that probably says an awful lot about public discourse and how young people view politics at the moment. But I just want you to remember his age and his enthusiasm. Another example. Mark Coughlin is 22 years of age. Gavin Sheridan is 29 years of age, and they established a website a number of years ago 10 months ago, called thestory.ie. And that website is dedicated to promoting transparency by publishing various documents online. And that includes previously unreleased or untabulated information detailing in open spreadsheets about how much the government spends on different things. So they look at how much CAB have spent, how much CAP payments have been made, the different reports by the banking inquiries and all these kind of things. In the last 10 months, they've had over 100,000 visitors to their website. How many young people do you know that in their time set up a website like this, that out of their own money and their friends' money that they get donations from, go about and get freedom of information requests to put that kind of information online? Another example. Earlier this year, for the first time in the history of Trinity College, a fully constituted committee of the Oireachtas sat in College Green. And I'll come back to Henry Grattan at the end. The Joint Oireachtas Committee on the Constitution was chaired by Sean Arda, and heard submissions from my Irish politics class on electoral reform. I teach 100 politics students in Trinity and Irish politics. 400 people went to that meeting on political reform. 400 people, mostly in their early 20s, had views about political reform. And their views, incidentally, are reflected in the committee's report, which has been published today on electoral reform. So in the middle of a busy semester, where students have essays and assignments, my students voluntarily prepared, researched and wrote detailed views on electoral reform. And they did this, they weren't getting any grades for it. They did this not as part of their overall assessment. They did this because they wanted to. They did this because they were asked to. They did this because politicians, by having something very innovative and different and asking politicians to come and listen and asking young people to contribute, they did. And all those submissions can be accessed at a website, and I'll come to that in a moment, that Professor David Farrell, Dr Owen O'Malley, myself and Dr Jane Souter have set up, politicalreform.ie. The middle part, part 2. So I'm now swimming back. Old Ireland had to die in order for a new one to be born. Professor Tom Garvin said this earlier this year in a documentary about Sean Lemass and the change in the 1950s away from protectionism to opening up the Irish economy. And I'm very struck when Pat Carey makes remarks about, and he makes a distinction, and he made reference to two particular politicians who he said talks themselves out of it. And then he made reference to the seniority and experience of other politicians who, in their wisdom and in their age, have contributions to make. And then he talked about a glass ceiling, and was it class or whether it was something else. I would suggest that it's a generational ceiling. And when you make remarks about how one particular age group has a contribution to make rather than another, that's a signal to people my age and people generally that, you know what, sit down there now and let us get on with it, because we know that's not good enough anymore. Because we're emigrating. 200,000 of us will emigrate. And then we hear this thing, and I hear it all the time. But sure, you need the experience, you know. And isn't it good that you go away? Because when you come back, you know, you can really contribute. Most of us have already been away. Most of us have already had fantastic experiences and have chosen to come back to Ireland, and now we are being asked to leave Ireland again. And this is different from the emigration in the 80s, because the generation that are leaving now are the generation that you have paid for and in third level, 50,000 to train a nurse. And somehow it's okay that they go away. It's okay that we export them, because they're the people that should be here. They're the people that should be contributing to life in Ireland, and not this. It just makes me so angry, because I've been to so many emigration parties, and I know they're not coming back, because people are making decisions about Ireland. It's not a voluntarily go. It's not a force to go away. It's I've decided to go away and I'm not coming back. And that's a different type of emigration, because it's a disillusionment and it's a giving up of Ireland. And that's not good enough. Two-thirds of Ireland's population, some 2.8 million Irish citizens, are younger than the Taoiseach and most of his cabinet. And I made that remark at a teachers' conference I was asked to speak at, and all the teachers cheered and laughed because they don't really like the government or the cabinet, was the impression I got. And then I turned to them and I said, also younger than you. And most of our people in our leadership positions, whether they're in politics or whether they're in unions or whatever they are of a particular generation. And my generation, the generation that is mired in debt, the generation that has all these incredible decisions to make, the generation that has to pay for the mistakes of your generation. But it has always been, throughout our history, that it is young people who have always challenged the traditional orthodoxies of older generations. Theobald Wolfe-Tone was 35 when he helped lead the 1798 rebellion. Robert Emmet was 25 when he was executed in 1803 as part of that rebellion. Charles Stewart Parnell was one of the youngest members elected to the House of Parliament, or the House of Commons. He was 29. James Larkin was 36 when he co-founded the Labour Party. Arthur Griffin was only 33 when he co-founded Sinn Féin. Sean Lemass was 16 in the GPO in 1916, at Taoiseach at 44. Michael Collins was 32 when he died. This is a young country. But those who seek to reform, to change, are often punished for it by those in authority, and not just political authority. Those in authority are in authority because authority has afforded them in the first place to enjoy the status of being in the status quo. And as the philosopher Bernard Russell once said, conventional people sometimes are roused to fury by departures from convention, largely because they regard such departures as criticism of themselves. And there are lots of different ways of letting people know what their proper place is, by the way. So let me quote you a speech from a former member of the PDs. Those who seek and insist on accountability in our democracy are nothing but troublemakers, begrudgers, character assassins, opponents of enterprise, saboteurs of agriculture, economic vandals or anti-employment. We are not anti-enterprise or anti-job creation. We just want accountability. We do not moralise, but we just seek democratic accountability for the way in which power is exercised in our society. And Michael McDowell said that in September 1994 in his contribution to the Beef Tribunal report. So has things changed? So over the last 10, 20 years, Ireland has gone through this process of self-scrutiny in the water, and we're swimming and we're wondering when the hell we're going to get out of the water, out of the sea, because it's getting cold now. Every sector of society, whether it's politics or the church or the guards or finance or whatever, there has been inquiries, there's been company inspectors' reports, there's been tribunals and everything else. And all those things would suggest to me that it's challenging authority, and it's challenging how we define authority. And I would argue that that's positive. And some people get very scared when they think, well, the Celtic Tiger washed away certain values in Ireland, and look at all these inquiries, and life is terrible. But that's assuming that values like blind deference, misguided loyalty, and a fear of asking questions were values that we should be upholding anyway. So I would see what's happened as very, very positive in Ireland, because it's allowed a lot of things to be washed away, and a lot of things maybe to be clarified, and a lot of things maybe to have a fresher approach to certain things. So I'm at the end, part one. And Pat Carey touched upon this in different ways, the different approaches to reform. Should it be incremental? Should it be gradual? Should it be dramatic? Or should we have any reform at all? So I'm going to give you 5 suggestions of reform, because I'm getting out of the water now, and I have some come through the bad stuff. A reformed relationship with the North. And that would include a vision of a future that we would actually implement the rest of the Good Friday Agreement. And there's a part of the Good Friday Agreement that hasn't been implemented yet, and it's the North-South Parliamentary Forum. And that perhaps would be a way to provide parliamentary space for members of the Oireachtas and Northern Ireland Assembly to exchange experiences. And that body perhaps could drive new initiatives such as an all-island energy market, or the creation of an all-island industrial development authority, and would maybe complement and give greater political legitimacy to a whole range of things that's already happening in the North-South bodies. Things like that an audience here would be very familiar with, cross-border roads, or a strategy for an all-island recovery and developing cooperation with the smart economy. So a reformed relationship with the North will be the first part of getting out of the water. A reformed definition of a republic, and Michael McDowell touched upon this yesterday. Our constitution, and I've written about this before, does not contain the word republic, even though we talk a lot about it. So we've actually never formally defined what a republic is, and the preamble of the constitution is actually contrary to the very notion of what a republic is. With its emphasis on, in the name of the most holy Trinity, from whom all is authority, and to whom, as our final end, all actions, both of men and states, must refer. Because in a republic, power is derived not from religious doctrine, and neither does a republic distinguish between the gender of its citizens. And symbolism matters, because it sets the tone for our expectations of ourselves. And those things do matter. A reformed governance will be a third suggestion of reform. And as I mentioned, David Farrell, Owen Malley, Jane Souter and I are co-authors of a website, politicalreform.ie, and there's detailed information and teased out information on all of these proposals, on many of the things that have been discussed here, and it's a forum that anybody can contribute to. So some of the things that have already been mentioned that don't require constitutional change, that would be great if they came about, and that Pat has touched upon, and Pat's party have been in government for 20 of the last 23 years, and some of these things they have not implemented. A register of lobbyists, publish all political donations, give a Dublin majority real powers, elect Ceann Comhairle by TDs, a Public Appointments Transparency Act. These are not big things. You actually don't need a piece of legislation to tell you to put your party's political accounts on your party's website. A lot of these things you don't need legislation, never mind constitutional change. But sometimes by saying that these things are so big, then that means they can never happen. And that's a very... it's what we used to do in football. We used to, put this real heifer of a woman on somebody that we knew was real small and hope that that would intimidate them. Another thing that we could do, regulatory impact analysis. And that's an evidence-based policy-making tool which allows for a systematic early consideration of the benefits, costs and compliance issues of new legislation, rather than the crisis-led approach or kite-flying that we've had for Irish policy-making. And if what's happened has been a policy-making failure, then we need to find new ways of making policy better. And by having that, and a very good friend of mine is one of the main advisors to the Canadian Prime Minister, and this is what they do, and their model would be seen as a world model. And he tells me that, we put the legislation online, and then we say to people, anybody, what do you think of it? And then they can make amendments. So instead of the discussion only being in the Dáil, the discussion is broadened out. And then so the amendments, so people make suggestions, and sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. But the civil servants have to say, well, we disagreed with this suggestion because, rather than legislation coming that perhaps people have some questions over for whatever reason. But it widens out the participation, it widens out the stakeholders. And echoing what Pat Carey said and what Pat Rabbitte has said, the Dáil will not be more powerful if it has longer sitting hours. It will not be more powerful if TDs are reduced. And all that is tinkering at the edge stuff. It's not real. Because maybe what we need to look at is a refined relationship between the executive and the Dáil in the first place. And in Article 28 of the Constitution, it states that the government shall be responsible to Dáil Éireann. But it's actually the other way around, in the sense that it's the executive that has the power and not the Dáil. And two more things, and then I'm finished. A reformed civil society, where things like maybe Irish citizens could have the vote to, citizens abroad could vote in Irish presidential elections. Numerous direct democracy initiatives has been suggested. New social partner models that seek to empower citizens. I could go on and on and on. And all these reforms are all on politicalreform.ie. And lastly, I want to talk about a reform Seanad. The first Senate met in 1922 in the National Museum in Kildare Street, and the first person to take his seat was the great-grandson of Henry Grattan. And between 1922 to 1936, of the 489 bills that the Senate received, they amended 182 of them before they became law. And the weight of the Senate's authority was such that of the 1,831 amendments, the Dáil agreed to 95% of them. And these were no ordinary amendments. This was the Court of Justice Act, the Ministries and Secretaries Act, the Local Appointments Commission. These were the legislation that founded the state. And the contribution that that Senate made is one that has often not been understood and not been fully appreciated. And their reforms were very, very real, like making sure that district judges were paid, for example, so to eliminate the abuse of the justice system that had occurred previously. But they were different times, of course. And the independence that the Senate had that time wasn't divided on party lines, for example. Perhaps it's something that cannot be replicated now, but it can show the potential of a second house and how a second house at the start of our democracy contributed to the founding of our state, and that maybe a reformed Senate would do likewise again. It would do things like review EU legislation which gets ignored in Ireland generally. It would take presentations from the public on matters of national importance. It would interview applicants for senior public positions, as is the case in the EU Commission. And also, the shortcomings of how we elect our Senate could be transformed into a virtue. And Pat touched upon this, and about how perhaps that there's only one, the type of people that go into politics are of certain occupations. So a reorganisation of the Senate would open up Irish politics to include representation of young people, of those with private sector experience that Ed Walsh often speaks about, the diaspora, and people from the north. So the potential of the Senate is something that could be very powerful today. And finally, to end, I want to quote from Henry Grattan. And last year was my first year teaching in Trinity, and I have to park my bike underneath Henry Grattan's statue. And it was such a thrill to think I was teaching in Trinity, in a place so much associated with him, and my office is opposite where he gave this speech in 1800. And he returned to public life to vote against and to speak against the Act of Union. And that was a time when the Parliament, for the first time in history, voted itself out of existence. It was a time when Ireland gave up on itself. But he didn't. And this was his last speech. The Constitution may for a time seem lost. The character of the country cannot be lost. I do not give up on my country. I see her in a swoon, but she is not dead. And though in her tomb she lies helpless and motionless, there is on her lips a spirit of life, and a cheek a glow of beauty. While a plank of the vessel holds together, I will not leave her. Let the courtier present his loyal sail to the breeze, and carry the barrock of his fate with every wind that blows. I will remain anchored here, with fidelity to the fortunes of my country, faithful to her freedom, and faithful to her flaw. And we don't hear enough about the expression of loving your country, and the expression of wanting to change your country, and the expression of getting out of the water with the sun on your back and knowing that you came through some very hard swim, and that we can do it if we wanted to. Thank you.